Thank you. Thanks, Judge. We're back on, this is what I was trying to hyperlink on earlier. Tell us what we're seeing in this screen.
This is a photograph generated through the comparison microscope. The microscope I use is a Leica FSC digital microscope as far as the photograph capabilities of it. And I'm using LED lighting during these photographs. So that's what's represented up at the top up here. What we're looking at is land impression number 1, which is the same starting point that I showed you on the HD 3D. And you'll see the agreement right in between these areas here. It's kind of dark, but you'll start seeing the agreement with these striated marks through here. And that's also represented on the HD 3D system.
All right. On the left side, as we're facing the screen, if I understand the notation, is that the autopsy bullet?
Yes.
And what do we see on the right side as we're facing the screen?
The right side of the screen is the test fire 3 from firearm number 1.
So do we have area of agreement on this slide?
Yes.
All right. Try not to mess this up here. Is this the slide that we were on before we hyperlinked?
Yes.
All right. Tell us what is significant about groove 1 and 2 on this slide.
Actually, if you go back to the
Okay.
previous image.
Yes. Go to the orange.
Yeah, click on that one's fine.
All right. Okay.
This is the same area that we just saw on the conventional microscope. This is what is shown on the firearm number 1 on the left side, test fire, and the evidence on the right. So this is the HD 3D capability, showing the agreement through HD 3D.
Of what we just saw in the conventional.
Versus conventional.
Okay. Now what are we looking at here?
This is the same photograph that we looked at previously.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So, well, it just shows the 2 test fires with the evidence.
Okay.
Starting point.
I'm going to go forward. That's what we saw. Is this where I'm supposed to be?
We're actually, yes, this is actually moving on to land impression number 2.
Okay, yes.
And it also shows agreement down in groove impression between 2 and 3. So this is your land impression number 2, this is land impression number 3, and this is your groove impression. And so we're seeing agreement in this area here. And if you'll notice, there's a divider that goes down through the center of this. The divider goes down through here.
Okay.
And you'll see it here.
What is significance about that?
Excuse me?
What's the significance of that?
Well, you're seeing the 2 different, left side is going to be the test fire number 1 to firearm number 1. On the right side is the evidence.
All right. Is this showing agreement on land impression number 2?
And also the agreement in this area here and here on the groove impression as well. There's also some agreement down through here.
And is this agreement between the autopsy bullet and firearm number 1?
Yes.
All right.
So now we're at land impression number 2. And if you'll click on the blue on the left side.
Okay.
Okay, this is, actually you can kind of still see a little bit of the blood on here. In this area here. Cleaned as best I could.
Mhm.
Like I said, it's difficult to clean. But you'll start seeing the agreement represented right through here. On the right side is going to be your test fire number 3. And on the right side is your autopsy.
All right.
On this side. This is your divider going right through here. That's your divider.
And Mr. Edwards, you bring up an important point. How many test fires did you look at?
I looked at all of them that were submitted as far as in the packets. I was examining each other. And then what I did was found ones that showed the most characteristics between the 2 individual ones, and those were the ones that were scanned in Montreal.
All right. How many test fires did you receive from firearm number 1?
All.
Does it help you to look in that bag, or can you not look at it without opening it?
Yes,
Okay. But you examined all of them?
yes.
Was that for for firearm number 1 and firearm number 2?
Yes, ma'am. There's, in Exhibit 54, there's 6 fire cartridge cases, 6 test-fired bullets. And in Exhibit number 55, there's 6 test-fired cartridge cases and 6 test-fired bullets.
Okay. All right, so now I go back to our slide and do you compare this within the 3D microscope?
Yes.
All right.
This was what was shown before.
Oh, I went backwards here.
Yeah, that was. Now,
I'm going to the 3D.
okay, we're on land impression number 3. So now I'm rotating the bullet around on both systems. I'm looking at the 3D on the conventional microscope and the same process for the HD 3D. There again, we have agreement in the land impression number 3. Left side is going to be your test fire, number 1. Or it's actually showing test fire number 2. And on the right side is the evidence bullet. So I found agreement between those areas here. And what I'm looking for peaks, valley, ridges, straight agreement that is microscopic in that land impression. So it's the land impression number 3.
All right. And should I click on the,
Yes.
all right?
And we click on the blue one. Blue diamond. Here again, this is on the conventional microscope. You see the agreement in the areas through here. Here, agreement here, agreement through here. And so this is land impression number 3. So I'm
Right.
starting to see agreement on all the land impressions that I'm looking at. They're microscopic, that are transferred from the fire to the test fire bullet from firearm number 1.
All right.
And if you click on the upper right orange one, please.
All right. What do we see here?
This is just another angle. With HD 3D, I can pivot, I can expand, zoom in, zoom out with the item that I'm examining. And I can also maneuver the lighting just like I can with a conventional microscope. So if you see this area here, and this area here, there's some microscopic agreement here as well as in here. And also, down in this portion here, at the shoulder area of the land impression number 3, there's agreement there as well. And there again, the reason why I did 3D along with the conventional methods is to try to show as clear as possible the area of agreement that I was seeing on the conventional microscope.
All right. All right, ready to go to the next area? All right.
Now we're looking at groove 3 and 4. What's that mean? Well, it's the groove area. You got the peaks and valleys as far as your land and groove impressions. And so land impression number 3 is going to be
Should I go conventional first or 3D?
this groove impression. This is land impression number 3,
Okay.
and this is land impression number 4. So what this is going to show is this area in between here.
All
That's
right.
what says groove 3 to 4.
I see. All right, should I do blue or orange here?
Orange. Right to left there.
All right.
Okay.
What are we looking at?
We're looking at agreement between, on the groove impression, between land impression number 3, which is up here, and land impression number 4. And this is an agreement between the two. This is test fire number 2 and firearm number 1. And this is the evidence on the right-hand side.
And again, when you say
This is
the
area of
evidence,
agreement right through here.
I'm sorry.
And also there's some agreement in the other areas up here.
What you're referring to, the evidence, that's the bullet recovered at autopsy, is that right?
Objection, leading your.
Or what do you mean by evidence?
What's in envelope 53D?
Thank you.
So it's 53D right here on this side.
Okay.
click on the upper right hand on the HU3D,
Okay,
just another more square look at the actual areas of agreement. And there again, we've got the divider here. You got test fire number 2, and over here, 53D. In this area right here. And this is the area of agreement that I'm looking at, right through here. You'll see the striated agreement, and also in the upper part of the land impression up here as well. So that's the area between land impression 3 and land impression 4.
all right.
Now we're looking at land impression 4.
All right, should I go into the blue here?
Go ahead and hit the blue, please.
What do you
Okay.
see?
A lot of agreement on land impression number 4, and you're gonna see it right through here. And also, one thing this, shows up is this kind of like a curve right through here. And also this area here. There's also a ridge right in the middle of this as well. And that was reproducing between the test fires and the actual, autopsy bullet, item 53B. So over here we got 53B, over here we got test fire, fire number 1.
Is that showing you all of those areas of agreement then?
Yes.
All right. Now up to the 3D.
Yes.
All right, explain to us what we see here.
There's a lot of agreement on this land impression number 4. Starting from the shoulder here. And down through here. There's also microscopic agreement in between these areas here as well. You see the striated marks going through here. And so there's a lot of agreement on this land impression here.
All right. Did I go too far?
Yes, please go back.
All right. This one,
Let's go down to, or click on the orange on the right.
okay. What do we see here? Oh, yes, thank you.
We've got test fire and fire number 1, test fire number 2. We also have the autopsy 53B on the right. And you can see the area of agreement through this here, this area right through here. And there again, you've got the area that's rising up here, same area rising up here, same one rising up there. And then we've got gross characteristics in the shoulder of the land impression, in this area here.
All right. Now we get to groups 4 and 5.
Okay, and between 4 and 5, I didn't see anything noteworthy.
Okay.
in that group impression. Now we're on land impression number 5. If you click on the lower left blue, please.
All right. What do we see of significance here?
Saw some significant agreement on land impression number 5, as indicated in the photograph. 53B is going to be on the right side. FA1, test fire 1 on the left. And you'll see where the arrows indicating the striated marks of agreement and that land impression.
All right.
And this is your divider here between the two.
Yes. You also did that in 3D.
Yes. Here again, we've got agreement right here, at the top up here. And this is your firearm number 1, test fire 1 on this side. And this divider actually kind of goes along this linear
Mhm.
mark here. And on the right side is going to be your 53B.
All right. We have another image in the 3D.
It's just another view of, canted a little bit more, but you see the agreement up here, the agreement in this area here, and also down toward the bottom in this area here. There again, this is your divider,
Mhm.
this is here, this is 53B. On the your test fire number 1, firearm 1, on the left.
All right. Grooves 5 and 6.
This is the area that's, up here is gonna be your, land impression.
Yep, there you go.
Land impression 5, this is gonna be 6 down here. So groove 5 and 6 is gonna be this area in between.
All right, let's look first at conventional.
Okay?
Show us what you see.
That's the agreement and where the arrows are indicating here. There's an area coming up through here, and also in this area right through here. So those also, individual characteristics showing up on the, groove between 5 and 6 land impressions.
Okay, and now on the 3D.
There again, we've got agreement right in this area here, right in there. Right there.
All right. Finally, land impression number 6.
Yes.
What do we see here?
Some agreement right here and right above it in this area here. And this, some agreement down through here as well.
All right. And let's look at it in 3D. I'm sorry, were you not done with that one?
Can we look at the 3D on that one?
No, that's where I'm going.
Okay. Here's another look at it with the 3D. That same area that we're talking about right through here. So on the left side is going to be your test fire 2. On the right side is the 53B. And this is your divider through here. And the 2.
All right. There's another image in the 3D, or different viewpoint. What are we looking at here?
Candidate more to the left. They're again getting the lighting from the side, and you can see the agreement between here and here. Between test fire 2 and 53B on the right. And this is going to be your divider through here like this.
Okay.
On a conventional microscope, the divider is going to be going out through the center, whereas with a 3D, you're going to have it where you can hand it and be able to see the same, dividing area.
All right.
And
In the year of 6 through 1, what was significant to you?
nothing.
All right.
There, 6 is here, land impression down below that was.
Oh, sorry. There we go.
This is your land impression 6, land impression 1. This is where the starting point was. And later again, I didn't see sufficient agreement in this area here.
Okay. All right. How many overall points of comparison and matches did you end up finding between firearm 1, test fires, and the bullet examined?
I didn't count them. I don't know.
Based on the information that you reviewed in your analysis, which firearm fired the bullet in 53B?
If I remember them.
All right. How sure are you?
I'm positive.
May I have a moment, Your Honor? I need to ask you a little bit more about how you got the bullet and the test fires. Where did they come from when you got them?
I received them from Detective Stone.
All right. What was your understanding about who Detective Stone is?
He's a detective with the Albuquerque Police Department.
Was it your understanding that he brought them from the Albuquerque Police Department evidence room?
I don't know where he got them from. He brought them.
All right. Had they been signed in with proper chain of custody, as far as you could tell?
I don't know what their proper chain of custody is for Albuquerque.
All right.
However way he brought them to me, I signed his forms. We booked in the evidence and sent in the police department. We followed our procedures. And then once they were released back to him, they were released from us to him to our evidence procedures.
All right.
So then whatever he does after that, I'm sure he's following the procedures back to Albuquerque, so.
Right. But they came to you from Albuquerque Police Department, your understanding?
It's actually lack of foundation, he's already said he doesn't know.
He said, I'm asking his understanding.
He's already answered where he got that.
You want to repass the witness? Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Edwards.
Good afternoon, sir.
Now, as I understand it, your sole task in this case was to compare a bullet that was submitted to you to test fires from 2 rifles to see if you could determine which rifle fired the bullet that was submitted to you. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
So certainly your work in matching a submitted bullet to a particular rifle doesn't reveal anything about the circumstances of a shooting, does it?
Absolutely not.
Nothing about when the person who fired the shot made the decision to shoot.
In most cases I work, I don't know the circumstances of the shooting, so I prefer it that way, actually.
And so, of course, it would reveal nothing about the position a person was in at the time a shot was fired or where the recovered bullet even struck them.
Absolutely not.
And of course, revealing nothing about whether the shooting itself was legally justified.
Absolutely not.
So your work in this case tells you nothing about the facts and circumstances of this case other than identifying the weapon which fired the bullet that was submitted to you.
And that was my only task.
Okay. Moment to confer, Your Honor.
We'll pass the witness. I don't have any questions, Your Honor.
Any reader?
Mr. Edwards, was it easy or hard for you to do your match based on the conventional microscope analysis?
It's actually on the scope.
Thank you. That's all right, Your Honor. May the witness be excused.
Your excuse, thank you. They may call their next witness.
Your Honor, the state would call SWAT Sergeant James Fox to the stand. Let me just look. Thank you.
Judge, can we turn on the Elmo, please?
You swear affirm to tell the truth and nothing but the truth and nothing else but the truth?
I do.
Thank you, may be seated.
James Fox.
Sergeant Fox, can you introduce yourself to the jury, please?
I'm sorry, ma'am?
Can you introduce yourself to the
Oh,
jury,
sorry.
please?
I'm James Fox, retired from APD, December 2015.
And what did you do for APD right before you retired?
I was assigned to the tactical section, which would have been SWAT, as a supervisor, which was a sergeant.
And were you the SWAT sergeant and one of the last officers to arrive at the scene where James Boyd was shot?
I was.
You arrived approximately 7:20, is that correct?
That's correct, ma'am.
And that was about 10 to 13 minutes before the shooting actually happened?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Can you tell the jury a little bit about yourself and how long you were with APD, please?
Sure. Went to college at Metro State University in Denver. Once I graduated college, I got on APD about 1993. During that time, I was in field services for 5 years. At 5 years, I
I tested for SWAT, got lucky, and I was able to accept it, and I did that position for another 7.5 years. Around that mark, around 7.5, I decided that I wanted to be a sergeant. I went ahead and studied and tested. I became a sergeant in 2006. Once we get promoted, we have to leave any kind of specialized unit, and we go back to the field. So I became a field sergeant from 2006 to about the end of 2009, 2010. And then at that time, I retested for SWAT because they had an opening for a sergeant, and I was accepted, and I was the SWAT sergeant from 2010 to right at the end of 2015, 2016.
Okay. Can you explain to the jury what SWAT, the acronym stands for?
Yes, ma'am. SWAT is Special Weapons and Tactics.
And what does a SWAT team do?
SWAT team is it's a life-saving organization, and we resolve critical incidents with the least amount of force, and we assist the field whenever they need a little extra help, but we bring techniques and tactics that help us resolve situations, like I said, with the least amount of force.
Okay, and I want to ask you about the phrase you used, a life-saving organization, because I'm not sure that's the image most people have. Can you explain to the jury what you mean by that?
And I think you're right. I think when people think of SWAT, they think of Hollywood or the movies, and we go out and we fire our weapons, and someone is killed. That's not SWAT. SWAT has usually about 99.9% of the time we go out and people are successfully taken into custody or saved. The SWAT calls you hear about are few and far between. It doesn't make ratings when you report that SWAT went out and successfully resolve the situation. So it's a life-saving organization. We go out, and because based on our training and some of the equipment and the tactics, we can usually resolve these without people getting hurt.
And does that include very difficult crisis situations that you are able to resolve successfully?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Do you have tools other than weaponry at your disposal on the SWAT team?
Yeah, one of the biggest tools we have is a CNT component. CNT is a crisis negotiation team. The SWAT team doesn't work without the crisis negotiation team. We both work in conjunction with each other. The crisis negotiation team will establish communication with a suspect or a person in crisis, and we work back and forth as far as getting information to each other, and they have great success on usually talking people into custody or resolving the situation without any force.
Who is on the crisis negotiation team?
Crisis negotiation team is made up of a supervisor, sergeant, usually 3 to 4 officers, and then a psychologist. And the 3 to 4 officers, they're all advanced trained. So you have a crisis intervention team, then you have the crisis negotiation team. And the crisis negotiation team, they have advanced training, they're a little bit more trained. And so you'll have those 3 officers that come out with the team, they have negotiation schools under their belt, and they'll be able to negotiate either face-to-face sometimes. Preferably we do it over a telephone. And then the psychologist is there for any questions.
Okay. Now, so you said crisis intervention trained officer. I think the jury's heard from us. Is that what is a CIT officer?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, can you compare the training of a CIT officer, first of all, to a ordinary patrol officer? And then I'm going to ask you to compare CNT over to the CIT officer.
Okay. So crisis negotiations officer will go through more schooling. And a lot of it is negotiations. They'll go through more advanced crisis classes. A CIT officer has a 40-hour block class, and it's a good class of dealing with people with mental crisis or going through mental crisis. And then a field officer usually hasn't attended those classes yet. And so he'll eventually go to those classes. As of now, almost everybody in Albuquerque Police Department is CIT trained.
Okay. Does it ever happen where a CIT officer is not successful at negotiating a circumstance and SWAT's C&T team is able to negotiate and resolve something peacefully?
Yes, it does happen.
Okay, and who makes, how does that work when when SWAT shows up to the scene? How do you decide whether to leave the CIT officer in place or to replace them with a C&T officer?
Usually it's, does the person have rapport? Does the CIT person or officer have rapport with this individual? Are they making any headway with this individual? And crisis negotiation officers will sometimes leave those people in place, but then other times they may take over. And then there's times where the crisis negotiations officer just doesn't have that rapport with the individual, and that's why you have several other officers on the team, then they'll try somebody else.
Okay, and how do you make the determination when you arrive at a scene whether to leave the CIT officer who's been negotiating with the person in place or to replace with a C&T? Who makes that decision and how do you make that
That would
decision?
be the crisis negotiations sergeant.
All right.
That will make that determination.
And how do they get information to make the decision about whether to leave the CIT officer in place or to replace them with a C&T officer?
So when crisis negotiation officers arrive at the scene, they start gathering information. They start talking to supervisors at the scene. They start gathering information of who the subject is or the suspect is. And then they get communication from the CIT officer of what was going on prior to their arrival. And so they take all of this information and they decide at that point what they're going to do.
Okay, so they actually talk to the CIT officer?
Usually.
What kind of information do they want to get from the CIT officer to help make their decision about whether to replace the CIT officer or leave them on the job?
What occurred prior to them arriving, if they were making headway with an individual, they'll ask, what were you guys talking about? What were some of the subjects that caused the individual to increase in their anger? What kind of topics did you de-escalate? Those kind of things.
Okay, let's go back to SWAT. Can anybody join SWAT?
No, there's anybody can put in for SWAT.
All right.
But there's a testing process.
Okay, and how do you go about getting into SWAT or qualifying for SWAT?
Well, it starts, actually, when you graduate the academy, your record follows you the rest of your career as a police officer. So a lieutenant for SWAT will get an applicant, we'll put out a testing date. We'll show that we have openings for maybe 1 or 2 officers. Applicants will put their application in, and during that time, the lieutenant of the unit will review disciplinary and use of force records on each officer. And then during that time, there are people who are disqualified based on discipline, based on use of force. If they make it through that process, then they have an actual testing process that is firearms proficiency. It's going to be written test. It's going to be physical fitness, decisional type shooting targets. Once you make it through that, then you have a basic SWAT school you have to go to. It's 128 hours minimum. In that class, you go over all the different tasks that you would be expected to perform as a SWAT officer on an activation.
Okay, do many more people apply than get into SWAT?
It varies, yes, it depends. I mean, when I tested, there was approximately 40 individuals who had put in.
And how many got accepted?
At that time, there was, I believe, 4.
Okay. How is SWAT viewed as far as the hierarchy of elite tactical units at APD?
well, we have our niche, we have an SOP that we follow, and supervisors and officers know kind of when to call us out, and they're expected to call us in certain instances. And, you know, some of those will be, you know, a hostage rescue, a barricaded subject who is armed and has felony charges, a sniper situation, a search warrant, arrest warrant that are high risk, crowd control, active shooter type situations, officer down situations. So we're just a gear in the machine, so to say, but we have a certain niche of certain training and tactics that we go to certain calls. We don't go to all calls, but we go to those type of calls.
Okay. Can you explain to the jury what chain of command is?
Sure, chain of command, we all have a supervisor we have to report to. So an officer reports to a sergeant reports to a lieutenant reports to a commander, and the commander may, depending on the flow chart, report to a major to a deputy chief to the chief. So everybody's held accountable to someone that's a supervisor above them.
Okay. Is there a chain of command among the units, different kinds of units or divisions in APD?
Yes.
All right. Can you explain where SWAT fits in the chain of command as far as when they arrive at a scene, what happens?
Well, when SWAT arrives at a scene, usually we look at the criteria. If the criteria fits that, and the criteria being the SOP from the Albuquerque Police Department, if it fits that criteria and we arrive on scene, then SWAT will then take over the scene. But again, SWAT goes out with officers, negotiators, there's a couple sergeants, a lieutenant, and all of that is chain of command. It all flows up and down as far as orders and disseminating information.
Okay. Does everybody know the rule that when SWAT is activated and comes to a scene that SWAT takes over?
I believe so.
Okay.
You're right.
Okay, and is that true? Does SWAT take over even if there's somebody who outranks a sergeant that's at the scene already?
Yes, if it's an actual activation, and it's been made an activation, then SWAT will assume responsibility of that critical incident.
Okay. Once you arrived at the Albuquerque foothills at 7:20, did you have the right to take charge of the negotiations with Mr. Boyd?
I had the right to make it a SWAT activation, but as far as the negotiations, I wouldn't have. I guess the last part I'm not sure. I wouldn't have done any of the negotiations myself.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, it was a bad question. I mean, did you have the right to take over and be in charge of what was happening there with Mr. Boyd when you arrived at 7:20?
Yes, ma'am.
And would everybody at the scene, all the other officers at the scene, based on the policies and practices of APD, understand that you had that right?
Objection, leading
Thank you, Your Honor. Yes, and if they did, then there are legal transmissions that notify the officers, that tactical will be taken over. We do it from our lingo, and then eventually we'll move officers from different positions and put those SWAT officers in those positions where field officers were.
Okay, and that's what I was going to ask you. One of the decisions you could make is to say, you all come down, we're putting our SWAT team in.
Objection, leading, Your Honor.
Is that right? I'll ask him to explain it. Can you explain whether you'd be able to make that kind of decision that you just discussed?
Sure. So as a SWAT supervisor, when I arrive on scene, I get information from the supervisor at the scene, and I make sure before I even go out that it fits the criteria, but even sometimes it's a little fuzzy over the phone, so I'll go out on my own and I'll see for myself. At that point, I try to make it an activation. During the activation, as SWAT officers are arriving, they are then put into those positions where field officers have been in. Say, if the field officers had an inner perimeter, then you would take a SWAT officer, move them to a inner perimeter position, and move that field officer out of that inner perimeter position.
Okay, you've used it, well, yeah, but you've used the term inner perimeter, so maybe
Okay.
we need to talk about perimeters here. So can you explain those to the jury, please?
So we have 7 tasks as a supervisor to perform when you get to a scene. We need to take over the communications. We need to establish the hot zone or the threat zone. Then we need to establish inner perimeter and outer perimeter. And I kind of jumped ahead. You need a command post, and then you look for a staging area, and then additional resources. So an inner perimeter is going to keep a scene from expanding. It keeps a critical incident from growing. It contains that. The inner perimeter keeps whatever's going on that's dangerous inside that inner perimeter from leaving the inner perimeter and causing harm or danger to people of the community. Then you have an outer perimeter. The outer perimeter, I'm able to stretch out the scene even greater as far as area. And the outer perimeter now keeps people safely out of that area where they could go to the inner perimeter.
And why you say people, who are you worried about getting into the inner perimeter?
Usually people of the community, citizens, other police officers. We work between the inner perimeter and the outer perimeter is where we do a lot of our work. We move resources, or we have a command post, we have rescue standing by. So there's a lot of things that the outer perimeter keeps people out from interfering with some of the work that's going on in between those two perimeters.
All right, and you said when we started off on the perimeter discussion that you would often make the decision to replace people on the inner perimeter with SWAT personnel. Can you explain why you decide to do that?
And it's a protocol. It becomes a SWAT activation and meets the criteria. Then we bring a group of individuals in a coordinated effort who have worked and trained together to take that inner perimeter. Each guy has trained with each other. They have training days where they do containment training, and they take over an inner perimeter. So then those field officers are removed from that inner perimeter, and they're usually put to an outside perimeter.
Okay. What advantage is it to have a group of people who have actually trained together in containment kind of situations?
You've had advanced training by doing that containment training. Then on top of that, you know what your partner officer is going to do. There's not a lot of verbal communication because I know that if I send this officer to this position, he's going to look to see what hole he can fill, and he just picks it up and he does it. So you have a group of individuals who are kind of like an orchestra. They're all moving in group together. They're all moving in sync together, and it's more effective, more fluid as far as handling the scene.
Okay. Do you have a team concept for the SWAT team?
As far as like a perimeter team?
No, sir. Just do you think of yourself as a team that works together?
Yes.
When you are approaching, and I forgot the term that you told me that you use, when you're doing either an arrest or an entry, do you put together a team where everybody has a different job?
Yes. Some of the terminology or some of the lingo would be an entry team. We put together an entry team, we put together an arrest team. They're kind of synonymous. They're kind of both the same thing, just depending on the incident we're at. An entry team, if it's a barricaded subject in a building, okay, the entry team is going to go inside. But the entry team is also an arrest team. I don't know if that makes sense. So they kind of use the same term. But each individual on an arrest team or an entry team has a job. And usually it's just one job. We don't want anybody multitasking. It keeps things simple, and each guy knows what the other guy's going to do. So I'll have maybe an individual who's going to make contact. It's good that everybody knows who's going to make contact because we don't have other individuals who, when someone steps out of the house, also wanting to make contact, and ultimately what happens is it confuses the suspect when they come out because there are several different people yelling different orders. So we limit it to one guy does contact, One individual will be what we call a hands-on, that's another lingo we use. He's basically just the guy who's gonna put handcuffs on somebody. He's gonna be the guy, and he could be two that are going to physically put the individual in flex cuffs or handcuffs. And then with that team, with that arrest team, you're gonna have several individuals with less lethal tools, and then you're gonna have lethal cover.
All right, and for the hands-on person, why do you only want to give them one job?
Because he's gonna be up close to the individual. All he needs to concentrate on is putting his hands on the individual and putting him in handcuffs. We don't want him to have a gun in his hand while he's going up and trying to effect an arrest. It's just easier for him to have one job, and that is to basically physically put the individual into handcuffs.
Okay. And what happens if that person has 2 or 3 other things that they're trying to do?
When we multitask, we make mistakes. So to limit those mistakes, that's why we give it to one individual. I mean, there are times where you have to multitask, but if we can help it, when we have enough individuals, then we can keep it simple, and one guy has one job, one guy has another job, and so on.
Okay, and if you were going in to do an arrest team, is there always one person whose sole job is to be the hands-on person to effectuate the arrest?
Objection, leading
When you do an arrest team, how many people are there assigned to be the hands-on person?
It depends, and that's what's nice of working with a team that trains together, you know, many, many hours. Is a lot of times you don't have to physically tell somebody you're gonna be the hands-on guy, or you're gonna be the hands-on guy. Depending on the situation, guys will pick up and say, this individual's coming out, he's not complying completely. Another guy may come up and you may have 2 guys that are like, hey, I'll help you, we'll be hands-on. You have a team leader a lot of times that will assign somebody, hey, you are hands-on if this guy comes out, or someone comes out quickly, hey, you are hands-on, you communicate with them. So it can change, and that's the nice thing about it. It's what we term as a force array. A force array is everything from contact all the way up to lethal force and in between. And you can fluidly move through that contact, that mere presence, to, if need be, lethal force, and de-escalate all the way from, if you need be, all the way back down to contact officer.
Okay, you talked about special training for your officers. Do they have training on things like using distance to keep people safe?
Yes, distance is part of the training.
Okay, and what are you trained about the use of distance to keep people on the team safe?
The old saying is distance is our friend. Creating distance helps us in our safety, and that's basically because of reactionary gap or lag time. Distance allows us to be able to react when someone does some type of action that could put us in harm's way.
Okay, and how about the use of time as your friend in a negotiation?
If people are talking, when people are negotiating, we are making progress, then time doesn't exist.
Okay.
It doesn't matter, I had a supervisor tell me, it doesn't matter how cold or how hungry you are. If you're out there and you're going to be there for the duration.
Okay. And are there time limits? Does SWAT set time limits on, we're only going to negotiate with this person for an hour or 2 hours and then that's it?
No,
Okay, why not?
because people are unpredictable. I mean, it's to set time limits. I mean, you just couldn't do it because if you're talking to somebody and you're making some type of headway, our ultimate goal is successful resolution. So if it's going to take time to achieve that, then we'll do time. And we've had several individuals who we aren't making any kind of headway with negotiations. It's just talk, and it's just the same talk for hours and hours, and then maybe we will do something different at that point. So there has to be some type of headway being made as far as contact.
Okay, what's the longest negotiation you've done that then was successfully resolved?
Objection, relevance.
do you have training also on when it's appropriate to use deadly force and when it is not appropriate to use deadly force?
Yes, everything in our training is ingrained with the department's SOP on use of force.
Okay, and Your Honor, could I get the Elmo up, please? Okay, there it goes, it's back, okay. It's like gremlins in the system, okay, all right. In 2014, was your team trained in the reactive control model?
Yes, they were.
Your Honor, I'm going to put up on the Elmo what's been marked and admitted as States 59, and I think you have a screen right in front of you, Sergeant Fox.
I do now.
Is this the reactive control model that your team was trained on?
Yes, every police officer in the Albuquerque Police Department at one time was trained under this.
Okay, and I want to ask you about this red zone here,
Okay?
where it says armed assailant. And just because you get into the red zone, are you allowed to shoot somebody?
No.
Okay, can you explain to the jury, please, what the limits are for police officers as far as dealing with armed assailants and when it is appropriate to shoot someone?
Going back to use of force SOP that works in conjunction with this reactive control model. You know, if a subject has the intent, the means, and the opportunity, and is showing an immediate threat, then use of force is warranted.
Okay.
And if that immediate threat is to cause great bodily injury or harm on an officer, another officer, or a member of the community, or if that individual is going to commit deadly force on an officer or another officer or a member of the community, then use of force is authorized.
Okay, and you talked about immediate threat. And so I want to ask you about, let me see if I can zoom in on this just a little bit, about these two categories right here. In this left-hand column, it says armed, threatening. Is that enough if someone is armed and just threatening to be able to use deadly force based on your reactive control model?
A lot of it depends on proximity.
Okay.
Armed threatening added with proximity changes it. Now,
Okay.
if you're 50 yards away with an ice pick and you're threatening, then, yeah, then maybe, you know, verbal warnings and show of force as the reactive control model shows.
Okay, and let me go to the next column, because the next column where it has deadly use of force talks about armed attack. And can you explain what an armed attack is?
An armed attack, again, would have, you know, the intent, the means, the opportunity. You have a weapon of opportunity, and you're intending to cause great physical injury or death. You have the means to carry out that intent, and you have the opportunity to do so.
Okay, and what is the attack part of that?
I mean, the attack part of it is the suspect is actually engaging in the attack.
Okay,
But it's sometimes a attack can be a surprise. You know, if an officer waits for an attack to begin, then there's sometimes, because of lag time and reaction time, that officer may not be physically able to stop that attack once it begins.
okay,
So sometimes to stop an attack before it begins, or to stop an attack that it can be completed quickly, you have to stop the attack before it begins, so.
okay, and it all depends on the circumstances
Sir, there
that
are
the
many
officers.
different circumstances, and this is just a guide. It doesn't cover everything that we encounter.
Okay, let me ask you, in this particular case, have you ever watched the videotape?
I've only watched the basic one that was on the news.
Okay, but other than that, have you tried to do an analysis to see whether or not the officers acted reasonably in using force in this case?
No, I haven't watched the full.
Okay, can you explain to the jury why you have not done that?
We've never had a debriefing, and we debrief critical incidents all the time on the department, unless it becomes something of a criminal matter, then we're not allowed to talk about it. So I've never had access to other videos that are out there other than what was on the news. what most people would see.
Okay. Let's talk about planning. And have you heard the phrase, "there are no real accidents, only poor planning"?
I have,
Do you agree with that?
sure.
Okay.
Sometimes, yes.
Tell me how planning works in SWAT.
If time permits, planning allows us to come up with a way to come to a successful resolution. If time permits, there are times whether it's a SWAT activation and there just isn't a whole lot of time to plan. I go back to the whole Hollywood thing, and we sit down with a big map and we tell this guy to go, that doesn't really work that way. You're on the hood of a car at 3 o'clock in the morning and you may have to go quick and you're assigning people, or guys may have to make a plan up at the arrest team or the entry team quickly because someone's being held as a hostage. So yes, planning is important, and there's always some type of planning, but the length of planning and the detail of planning is always going to vary.
Okay, and who's in charge at a SWAT activation of making the plan?
So you'll have a team leader, an assistant team leader. Both of those are informal ranks, but they're leadership positions. And those individuals who are a team leader or an assistant team leader have shown qualities that they can lead, they can get guys motivated, they've shown exceptional decision-making. So a team leader, if he's in town and he's on a call, will assist in coming up with a plan for a certain situation. The assistant team leader may chime in, they may come up with a plan, then they'll come to me with the plan. We'll tweak it here and there if we need be, or I may look at the plan and go, I like it, I don't like it, but the ultimate say-so is the tactical commander, who is the lieutenant, and then we present the plan to him and he authorizes it.
All right, what kind of information, when you arrive at a scene, do you try to gather to make the best plan?
If I have time, I talk to the supervisor on scene. I try to find out everything they've dealt with as far as when they first arrived on scene to the point where I arrived on scene. You know, is there hostages? Are there children inside? Is there weapons? You know, what are the charges? Who are the victims? Do we have a detective? Are there warrants started? There's quite a bit that I'll look at. I'll look at the neighborhood. I'll look at the house, to give you an example, if it's a barricaded subject in a house. I look at a house, I look to see at all the openings. Are the neighbors evacuated? There's a lot as far as, and if I have the time, that we go through as far as getting information on the scene. All of it important. Some of it, because of time, we get it to it when we can.
Okay, when you arrive at a scene, how do you figure out who's in charge at the scene? Before SWAT gets there, I mean, who's been in charge there before you get there?
It's usually an officer of rank, either a sergeant or a lieutenant, in some cases a commander.
Okay, and how do you learn before you arrive who's the person that has been in charge at the scene?
Usually they're the ones that have called me and expressed, hey, this is what I have. Does this meet the criteria? I evaluate it. If I think it does, then I call my lieutenant, or they call the lieutenant, he calls me, and we evaluate it. If it's on the move, it's fast, we go to the scene, and it's pretty easy to figure out who's running the scene just by radio transmissions or by getting to the scene and going, the first supervisor that walks up to you, okay, are you in charge, or you've been running the scene? That's usually how you find out.
Okay, why is it important to have one person in charge of a scene when there's something going on?
And this all varies on scenes. I mean, with one person in charge, and he takes himself out of that role of what we call playing. If he's not up there and getting sucked into the situation, he's able to step back. It's important that he remains kind of away from that action so he can make clear decisions and say, okay, I need to do this, I need to do that, and that one individual can get it done. Now, if you have, again, I go back to a SWAT activation, it's helps greatly to have a couple supervisors on scene, or 3. If I get to a scene, SWAT will immediately take over the inner perimeter. But I know my limitations, and I know I can't multitask the inner perimeter, all the logistics go along with the inner perimeter and the outer perimeter. So I look to the field sergeant, who usually is the one that called me out, and I say, will you handle the outer perimeter? So now he's in charge of the outer perimeter, and all the problems that come along with that, he can handle and doesn't interfere when I'm handling the inner perimeter. So, again, it's based, the one supervisor rule is kind of based on what you have, and what the scene is.
Okay, is it a good idea or a bad idea to have people just making decisions on their own without checking in with the supervisor?
Usually you want to check in with the supervisor.
Because?
The supervisor is ultimately responsible for the performance and the actions of their officers.
Okay, and once you have a plan, is it important to communicate the plan to everybody who's on site?
You communicate, if you can, you communicate it to everybody on site, but there are times where you cannot communicate to everybody, but you communicate it to the people who are directly affected with the situation that's going on. And to give you an example, I go back to a SWAT incident. If I have an arrest team or an entry team that's come up with a plan, we may radio that plan, and everybody knows that plan on the entry team and arrest team, but maybe guys in the perimeter team aren't privy to it because it's not going to affect them. We try to keep radio communication down to a minimum, just because there's things happening all the time. And if you're clogging up the air with unnecessary dialogue, then something can happen and they don't get the message out to us, or there's something critical and we miss it.
Okay, were you ever able to get a plan in place in the 13 minutes or so before the shooting happened, after you arrived up at the foothills in Albuquerque on March 16th of 2014?
No plan was developed. I went through the basic steps of trying to figure out where my inner perimeter was, my outer perimeter, where officers were on the perimeter. One of the responsibilities is, does every individual on a perimeter position have another officer with them? That's for safety. Basic steps of trying to figure out where my inner perimeter was, my outer perimeter, where officers were on the perimeter. One of the responsibilities is, does every individual on a perimeter position have another officer with them? That's for safety. Figure out where my inner perimeter was, my outer perimeter, where officers were on the perimeter. One of the responsibilities is, does every individual on a perimeter position have another officer with them? That's for safety. Basic steps of trying to figure out where my inner perimeter was, my outer perimeter, where officers were on the perimeter. One of the responsibilities is, does every individual on a perimeter position have another officer with them? That's for safety. When I arrived, I'm trying to get my inner perimeter, because I know once I get my inner perimeter, then I'm going to be able to slow this thing down a little bit, and I'm going to be able to fulfill the other steps that I need to do.
Okay, and before we get to what happened on March 16th, can you tell the jury how you ended up going out there and what you were hearing before you actually ended up going out to the foothills?
Sure. I had radio control. That's the supervisor of radio. Give me a call on my department issue phone and said, we have an incident out in the foothills open space area. Have a male who is displaying mental illness type behavior and communicating and that kind of mental illness behavior. They said that he was armed with knives, that he was threatening to kill officers, and he was actively resisting any kind of negotiations that was taking place between the officers and himself.
Okay, and what happened as far as other SWAT officers starting to respond to the scene before you got there?
At that point, I was like, all monitor, supervisor at the scene was called.
Okay, and who was that supervisor that you called at the scene?
It would be Sergeant Carpenter.
Jason Carpenter?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, and why did you call Jason Carpenter at the scene?
Because I was informed by radio control that he was the supervisor in charge.
Okay, and what kind of conversation did you have with him? What were you trying to find out from him?
Told him I heard a little bit about the information that I received from control. Do you need extra bodies? Do you need a response? What do you have? And he says very confidently, no, we're good. I have a couple of canine officers here. I have officers that are negotiating. We're good. So I went ahead and okay, and at that point we ended our conversation.
Okay, so he did not request SWAT activation.
That's correct.
All right, and how did it seem to you as far as whether he thought he had the situation under control at that point?
Based on my training out in that area and my experience with other activations, SWAT calls in that area, it concerned me just because I knew about the terrain, I knew about elevated positions. I realized it was getting close to night, and the light was going to the dark was going to affect us as far as movement and where the suspect may be. I knew there was a Sunday afternoon, and I knew at Sunday afternoons with nice weather that we were going